Under the rule of President Xi Jinping, China has become a 21st century power and a formidable competitor to the United States.
Some of it is just that China is rising in power, but some of it is also Xi Jinping's own ambitions.
Having consolidated greater power than any other leader since Mao and abetted by a local cadre that makes up China's top leadership, Xi's global ambitions for China has led him to abandon decades of Chinese restraint in favor of a muscular approach designed to restore China's historical status as a leading power.
The reason why China has become more dangerous and why they're struggling with so many internal problems is this over-concentration of power that Xi Jinping has introduced.
This is Global Insights by Network 2020 and the 5th episode of our Deep Dives China series, where we seek to understand China's objectives at home and abroad. Today, the connection between Chinese domestic politics and foreign policy, and how China's leadership and political system shape them. Today, we're joined by Professor Susan Shirk, research professor and chair of the 21st Century China Center at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at UC San Diego, and the author of Overreach, How China Derailed Its Peaceful Rise. Moderating the discussion is Courtney Doggett, president of Network 2020.
I imagine that some people are coming here expecting some answers about what China's grand strategy is. After all, this is something that I think we keep hearing about in the news. I read an article in the Washington Post the other day that summed up this outlook, I think, quite well. And this was after Rishi Sunak's visit. The Washington Post published a piece that said, in response to President Biden's comment about Ukraine, the piece wrote, and this is not a quote from Biden, but just from the piece, that China, a Russian partner with its own aims of world dominance, is watching. He, President Biden, and others have warned. So I think that there's a lot to take issue with in that sentence. It isn't to say that the US shouldn't be concerned about China, but the way in which we express that concern, I think, is very important. And I think if the electorate blithely assumes that China's goal is world domination because that's what we're being told, perhaps that's the policy we might get. So with that, welcome, Professor Shirk.
Well, thanks so much.
Overreach was originally meant to be an update, as I understand, to your 2008 book, China, a Fragile Superpower. But ultimately, this became a standalone book. And so I'd just be curious to start off with, what sort of developments and changes occurred in that time that led you to publish an entirely new book?
Well, thanks so much for that question. Writing a book like this always takes much longer than you originally anticipated. And you're right. Originally, the publisher asked me to update Fragile Superpower, which was published in 2008, 7 and 8. And what I observed actually just at that time, 2006, 7, 8, was some changes in China's behavior, its foreign policy behavior, especially, but also its domestic behavior. And the argument of fragile superpower was that China's leaders are always highly politically insecure because they weren't elected. They don't really know what people think of them. They have no idea when there might be a public split in the leadership or the public might rise up against them. And this insecurity was particularly acute after the Tiananmen crisis in 1989, when the regime really did come close to collapsing, because you did have a split in the leadership. You had massive protests in more than 130 cities in China for weeks and even months. And only because the military followed Deng Xiaoping's orders to forcibly put down the demonstrations did the People's Republic survive. So after that, the leaders of China have really been worried that something like that could happen again. And of course, it could happen again. So what they did, however, in foreign policy is try to pursue a policy of restraint and reassurance in order to maintain a good international environment, international context, to put their emphasis on China's economic development so that people's livelihood would improve and they would be very satisfied with Communist Party rule and not worry so much about their freedoms. And, you know, that worked pretty well. And the focus was on economic development. But when it came to foreign policy, most of it was reassuring and restrained. But in the relationship with Japan, the issue of Taiwan, and to a certain extent with the United States, what you saw was the growth of popular nationalism as China developed a more commercial media, internet. Naturally, these publications wanted bigger audiences. So there was a lot of stirring up of nationalism, but it was focused just on really Japan and Taiwan. So it was really a story about the media, nationalism. That was the main story of Fragile Superpower. But when I looked at the changes in Chinese actions in around 2007, 2008, it didn't seem to be driven by those same factors. This is especially true with the South China Sea. What we saw in the South China Sea, it had not been a hot button issue for the Chinese public. Very little attention paid to China's disputes over who had sovereignty over the islands in the South China Sea and over the waters itself. And but then around 2006, 7, 8, we saw Chinese, mostly civilian maritime vessels like fisheries, Coast Guard, marine surveillance. They started shoving around the fishing boats and the cutters from the Southeast Asian claimants, Vietnam, the Philippines in particular. And I couldn't really understand why, what was going on. I knew that they were not being pressured by popular nationalism. So as I went to update Fragile Superpower, I didn't really know, could I be making the same argument and just updating it? I was puzzled what was going on. And so I went off on this quest to find out what was going on in Chinese domestic politics that might be causing this shift. And at the same time, I saw a shift in domestic practices, domestic behavior before the Beijing Olympics, where you saw a real crackdown on society, non-governmental organizations, and the media, as the commercial media and the internet engaged more people. The censorship, which had been relatively light up through about the time of the Olympics, got a lot tighter. And at first I thought this is just about the Olympics, because in China, when you have big events like this, they always tighten up right before, and then afterwards they go back to normal. But in this case, they did not go back to normal. They have not loosened up ever since. So to me, this was the puzzle that motivated me to write Overreach, because this kind of new style of behavior, which I felt was really harmful to China's own interests, I was trying to figure out what was going on that was driving it.
Thank you for taking us on that journey. And I find the piece about media fascinating. But when it comes to the term overreach, I'm curious if, what do you mean when you say overreach, and how, in your mind, has Xi's administration done so?
Well, the meaning of overreach is not just to behave aggressively, or in the case of domestic politics or domestic social control, more repressively. Overreach, what overreach means is taking things too far in a way that snaps back to harm yourself. So it's self-defeating action is the definition of overreach that you get in many dictionaries, and the one that really resonated with me, because what I saw was that this new style of Chinese behavior was sparking a backlash, an international backlash, but also even a domestic backlash, say from private business and many middle-class people and young people. So that's what I mean by overreach. Thank
you for that. So how did China derail its peaceful rise, as you suggest in the title? Like, what factors led to the turnaround in China's foreign policy from Deng Xiaoping's dictum of hide your strength, bide your time, to this idea of wolf warrior diplomacy that has gotten quite a bit of press under Xi? Well, I'm actually a student of comparative politics. I'm not an international relations scholar, even though I did foreign policy in the government, and I'm very concerned about China's relations with the world, and especially the United States. And so the way I start out is by looking inside China and trying to figure out what are the domestic dynamics that might be driving this shift in policy, because you see this in every political system, every country. I really see foreign policy as just another policy output of a domestic political competition of some sort. And I even like to call the party leaders in China politicians, because although they're not elected, they are constantly maneuvering to advance their own careers and to protect their own personal security. So I started trying to figure out how China's overreach might have begun. And this was really puzzling, because this is a period under Hu Jintao. So one of the big surprising facts about China that I think people will learn when they read my book is that it didn't just all start with Xi Jinping. It actually began under the collective leadership of Hu Jintao. And it was driven by the competition among different interest groups. Hu Jintao was a relatively weak leader. He was quite well-intentioned. He was in the sense that he was trying to strengthen support for the party among the public by making the system more responsive, not having elections, but actually he introduced internal party elections in order to nominate the leadership. And of course, he was following Deng Xiaoping's advice to try to find a way to have peaceful turnover of power at the top.
So Deng introduced term limits, retirement ages, so that after 2 5-year terms, the top leadership would step down and a successor would come into Zhongnanhai. Now, this was a remarkable achievement. It's really the only communist country that ever managed to achieve this peaceful turnover of power. And yet we see just this past year how Xi Jinping has now abandoned this practice, and he's now in his 3rd term, which he achieved by revising the Constitution. So that's a puzzle. I have a lot in the book that describes how and why collective leadership led to overreach. People are less interested in that today because that's not the problem we have today. By the end of the Hu Jintao era in 2012, actually 5 years before, Xi Jinping won one of these internal informal elections to become the successor. But nobody imagined that he would rule China in this highly centralized dictatorial manner the way he has today. But he was able to make the case that you needed stronger leadership because collective leadership was a good idea in theory, but it wasn't very successful. And for one thing, it led to massive corruption, which was the main argument she made for a more concentrated power system.
It's very interesting, and I'd like to stay on the leadership piece just for a moment too. How do you think that Xi's ambitions and what seems to be a group of loyalists, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that he's elevated to China's top leadership, how do you think that they will shape this, their domestic policy as well as their foreign policy?
Well, I think there's been a lot of focus on Xi Jinping as an individual. Certainly in the United States, we're kind of vilifying Xi. We talk about him as a dictator, which he certainly is. But the reason why China has become more dangerous to the United States and other countries, and why they're struggling with so many internal problems, especially related to the economy, is that this over-concentration of power that Xi Jinping has introduced has led to what Deng Xiaoping said when he was criticizing the Mao system after Mao died. He said, over-concentration of power leads to arbitrary decision-making. It leads to mistakes under Mao, like the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution. Well, Xi Jinping has been making its own mistakes. And the system leads to overreach because everyone, all the officials under Xi, at every level of the system, right, going right down to the local governments, are afraid that Xi will go after them if they don't demonstrate how loyal they are. Xi introduced this anti-corruption campaign in 2013, right after coming to power. And this anti-corruption campaign, their corruption had become very endemic, very serious under collective leadership. So the public really supported this effort. But what it turned into was a purge of all the political figures, including very senior ones, who might be rivals to Xi Jinping. And this purge continues to this very day. It's gone after, it's put into jail through party justice, hundreds of thousands of officials. So, and today, some of the targets of this purge are the same people in the security apparatus and the party discipline apparatus who were carrying out the purge. They were the inquisitors in the earlier stages. So it's become what Zbigniew Brzezinski called a permanent purge. So this puts tremendous pressure on all the political officials in the system. And they are striving to show their loyalty to Xi Jinping in order to protect themselves. So to do that, they jump on the bandwagon behind what they believe Xi Jinping's preferences are and carry those out in kind of over-compliance is what I call it, carry it out in a more extreme manner. And they're too afraid to report up the ladder what are the real costs of these policies. So that's how this system generates overreach.
It's interesting. It sounds like in trying to root out one problem, the problem of corruption, Xi traded that for another, which is this lack of good feedback. Could there have been a third way in your mind, with your understanding of the system? Would there be another way to approach this so that he could get results that are, that have a little bit more balance, but without the corruption?
I'm so glad you asked me that question because much of my work, I've learned from Jack Snyder, who's an international relations scholar at Columbia. And he wrote about Germany and Japan, how they self-encircled by their aggressive behavior, creating this fear from other countries. And he described it as being driven by these interest groups. And so that was a clue for me, and I started looking for that. But in China. But what I realized is that, first of all, these interest groups were driving overreach domestically as well as internationally. So overreach was not just a foreign policy phenomenon. So that's a little different from Jack Snyder's work. And then I also realized that it was the particular coalition of interest groups in China that explain the policy outcomes. And actually, it could have been different because those interest groups were mostly related to internal security and to military, people's armed police, party discipline, and heavy industry, industrial interests. So including, of course, censorship. So I call that group the Control Coalition. And that's the group which really led to overreach in China. But if Hu Jintao had given other groups who had an interest in loosening up, had an interest in good relations with the outside world, like private business, like coastal cities, like the intellectuals, academics, professionals. If he had figured out a way to give them more of a voice in the Chinese policy process, a kind of reform coalition, then yes, I think things could have been different. So what would it have taken to do that? I think it probably would have taken, and this is the argument I make in the book, that they'd have to go a little further than what Deng Xiaoping had introduced. In other words, you really can't rely on the institutions just within the Communist Party to check the overconcentration of authority. You have to have a legislature, and you could have brought in the private business through the legislature. Remember Jiang Zemin back in the 90s, he had this idea of 3 represents, of bringing more of private business into the party. But in the end, it turned out to be very minimal number of private business people coming into positions of authority within the party. So I think it would have taken a more independent legislature and legal system to change the balance, the internal balance in China, and enable them to sustain this more responsible, restrained foreign policy.
Network 2020 bridges private sector and foreign policy worlds, fostering connections and opening dialogue on global issues. As a non-profit organization, we rely on the support of listeners like you. If you're a fan of Global Insights, we humbly ask you to consider making a donation by visiting network2020.org. From all of us, thank you.
So, just sticking with this connection between the domestic situation and foreign policy, how, when you're looking at China's domestic situation right now, how in your mind is it playing into its foreign policy aspirations? What's the relationship between the two, and how do you see Xi prioritizing, among that panoply of policy needs? How do you see him prioritizing?
Well, it's certainly true that Xi Jinping is a more ambitious leader for China's role in the world. And, some of this does come just from China having a bigger economy than it did before, having more capabilities. So some of it is just that China is rising in power. But some of it is also Xi Jinping's own ambitions. And also, I think he believes that he can maintain his own popularity by showing that China really has become not just a regional leader, but a global leader as well. But, I have always assumed that China would become more ambitious over time because it's a major power and it has a historical legacy of being a very powerful country. And, frankly, from the standpoint of America, I don't really see any problems with China becoming a leading country in the world and being ambitious. And there are many people in China I've talked with who have a vision of how China could achieve its ambitions in a peaceful way. And that had been the way they'd been doing it up until the mid-2000s. So what does that mean? That means trade agreements. And China is now the largest trading partner of more countries in the world than any other country. So economic integration, China's soft power. China has a tremendous historical and cultural legacy. China has a lot of smart people and can achieve a lot of great things like its space program, going to the moon, its achievements in biotech. There are a lot of ways that China can achieve its ambitions in ways that are compatible with the interests of other countries. I think, but she went beyond that. Some of it was economic diplomacy, which was pretty successful, frankly. The Belt and Road Initiative, which is a kind of prestige program for Xi Jinping. You know, if other countries welcome the loans, they want the infrastructure, they need the infrastructure, they see opportunities for their own people to participate in the projects, then I think that's all well and good. And I always felt that it would be a mistake for the US to oppose it per se. But one of the problems was that the way the Chinese did it was to monopolize all the contracts, all the economic opportunities. It didn't open it up to companies from other countries, including the host country. So, you know, it was, and the expectations of the host country were that they followed Chinese political dogma, especially related to these domestic issues related to Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Taiwan, etc. So, and then Xi largely, in order to maintain his support from the military, which is, of course, essential for any autocratic leader, you know, he really beefed up the military and allowed the military, as well as civilian forces, to really start pushing its neighbors around in the South China Sea, the East China Sea with Japan, more aggressive behavior in the Taiwan Strait toward Taiwan, and then economic coercion toward Australia, sanctions toward Australia when they called for investigation, international scientific research on the origins of COVID, the pressure, the punishment of South Korea. They even stopped buying Norwegian salmon and other exports for years when the Nobel Prize was given to a democratic dissident from China. So this kind of behavior made enemies, not friends. And it showed Xi's poor judgment. And yet, in this type of system, people felt that they had to fall into line, which is why you see this wolf warrior diplomacy. I mean, Wang Yi, who is now the senior most foreign policy official in China, is someone I know very well for many years. He's a person I wrote about in Fragile Superpower as the architect of China's very effective regional strategy, making lots of friends in Asia. But now he turned into a wolf warrior. So what I'm watching to see is, I know that he sees the backlash. You know, Xi Jinping might not be aware of how strong the backlash against China's overreach is. But I know that Wang Yi understands it. And I'm watching to see whether or not he might be able to craft a more moderate Chinese foreign policy. He might be able to convince Xi Jinping that actually he and China would benefit from revising this wolf warrior diplomacy.
Thank you. I'm curious. I just wanted to pick up one small point in that, with all of the examples that you gave of how some of the foreign policy, particularly when it came to Belt and Road, has made more enemies than friends. When it comes to the contracts, do you think that was that done as a strategic decision not to open it up to other countries, including the host country, or do you think it was just a product of the system from which China emerged, that was just sort of how it's been done?
The latter. I think, bidding, open markets, sharing the benefits, with companies from other countries, that's not something that's been the practice in the past. Although, of course, China did open up its market and go from central planning to a market economy. But the part of the overreach story is that by 2006, the Chinese central government is reclaiming its dominant power over the economy. And we see today how that continues. State-owned enterprises continue to be kind of the economic base of Communist Party rule. And private business has no voice. Private business has no political voice in China. And a lot of the problems that China has today derive from that very fact.
Thank you. I think that's a great point. I have a couple of questions that I'd like to conclude with. On that economic piece, you mentioned again, sort of who has a voice in the economy and at the table on the economic side. And when it comes to domestic policy, economics is clearly such an important driver. I mean, particularly after Tiananmen, and that was sort of the direction that China went in. How do you assess the current economic situation, and how is that affecting domestic policy, foreign policy, all of Xi's ambitions?
Well, that is really, that question is front and center right now, because there's a lot of disappointment that the post-COVID recovery has been pretty feeble in China. It hasn't been what people expected it would be. And economists are debating why that is the case. And some of the reasons are structural, sectoral. They would have happened no matter what, like the demography issues, the fact that the working age population is a smaller proportion of the public now, right? And China had these decades with all these able-bodied young and middle-aged workers, which really gave a boost to its economic growth engine. But now we have more, the population is aging. Of course, the one-child family policy, going back to Mao, that was another classic example of arbitrary decisions that were harmful to China in the end. But then some of the problems in the economy today are self-inflicted. And I think there are many people in China who realize that. So in a sense, they're kind of blaming Xi Jinping and his team for making mistakes. Certainly the crackdown on the private sector before zero COVID, I mean, really beginning 2015, then continuing the destruction of the after-school tutoring industry, the attack on the internet companies, really alarmed private business. You've seen major capital flight, private entrepreneurs leaving China, or at least sending their families overseas. So there are a lot, and the real estate bubble. The real estate bubble is clearly the result of policy failures, and also the fact that they have not been able to introduce taxes to put local governments on a fiscal foundation. Local governments are going broke, and the costs they had to absorb to keep zero COVID lockdowns going, all this testing and everything added to that problem. And now the local governments are broke. And if you look at the bond markets, my colleague Victor Shirk, keeps me up on all this. And, they have local government fiscal problems, really. Local government debt is very serious. So they're more constrained fiscally now. And so what does that mean? Some people are saying we've reached peak China. I don't see that China's economy will decline. It will continue to grow because there's still a lot of untapped demand in China, especially in the smaller cities. But it's not going to grow as fast. And it's going to have to make choices, or are they going to put money into social goods, education, health, pensions, which are they really haven't done that yet in China. Are they going to do that, which of course will be a way to sustain their popular support? Or are they going to spend the money to build up their nuclear capability, other military capabilities, to build like this new city that Xi Jinping is building outside of Beijing? There are a lot of waste of money that Xi is doing rather than making choices that will actually make him more popular with the public. The other thing that's happening is there's a return to more state control over agriculture, which is kind of shocking to a lot of people, setting requirements for how much land has to be cultivated in food, because they are worried about food security. She is using this belief, stirring up the belief that America is suppressing and containing China, and actually America is provoking the possibility of war with China. So security dominates development, and even in agriculture.
Professor Shirk, thank you so much. This has been an incredible hour plus. I think I can speak for everyone who is listening when I say, we've all benefited tremendously from your knowledge. So thank you for taking the time to share it.
Well, thanks so much for the great conversation. Really appreciate the opportunity, and would love to hear what people think about my book.
Yes, absolutely. 100%. That'd be great. Thank you. Take care.
We can't thank you enough for being a part of this episode of Global Insights. To dive deeper and to learn more about how you can join our community, visit us at network2020.org.